Dr. Lyle has been working in the state of Indiana and in the area of aging for at least 8 years. He's currently Associate Professor of Sociology at Indiana University. And those of us who attended the state meeting heard him talk, contrasting two communities and their approaches to aging and what investigators learn by visiting two communities. He's a graduate of Yale University. He's a member of the American Sociological Association, the Ohio Valley Sociological Association, and many others. We're fortunate to have him with us today to talk to us about emerging concepts in aging. Without further ado, I'll turn the meeting over to our guest speaker, Dr. Lyle.
I want to thank Mr. Workshop as he leaves. It is St. Patrick's Day, and I'm Irish, as someone noted, and it's pleasant to see some green in the audience. I'm a little disappointed. I hope they would have brought in a green blackboard, but it's black, you know, as it should be, I guess. I'll use it a little later on. I hope to make something clear. If you were at the meetings of the State Commission last fall, you may remember I used the blackboard and it didn't get clear. It was a little mixed up. But this time I'll try to make it clearer. I also wonder whether or not this is a West room. It just struck me as I was sitting here that you may not know that the Irish have a special way of handling the problem of aging, or at least they did in traditional Irish peasant society. The poor people there had rather large families, and generally the way the problem of growing old was handled was that the older children would be forced off the farm, and the only one who would remain on the farm with the parents ultimately would be the youngest son. Property went from the father to the youngest son instead of from the father to the oldest son, as is the more familiar case in Western European societies. When it came time to retire, though, they would build a small room on the west side of the house, and all Irish countrymen's cottages had west rooms associated with them. When retirement came, the ritual was that the mother and father would move into the west room, and the son would know then that he was Mr. Workshop so far as the farm was concerned, and that retirement and aging had occurred. Well, this may be a west room. I don't know if it is, but southeast. Well, it could be worse. It could be north, I suppose. That would be very bad. I'm going to talk today about emerging concepts of aging, and I'm going to speak about what's happening in the social sciences, particularly in sociology, since I am a sociologist. Throughout the history of the social sciences, there has been some interest in the social and psychological aspects of aging, but it is only in recent years, with the great increase in the number of elderly people, that new concepts and theories have been emerging to explain it. Initially, sociological interest in the phenomenon was in its social problems aspects. But inside the universities, there was a concern with fact-finding and with definition. I recall my own graduate student days studying with Leo Simmons, the social anthropologist who wrote the landmark book in this field, entitled The Role of the Aged in Primitive Societies. We spent a great deal of time trying to define just what an aged person was, and also testing our definitions against the mass of data that Dr. Simmons had collected. Our discussions often left us disturbed by the emphasis, almost exclusive in American society, upon chronology as the basis of the definition. An old person is someone over the age of 65. Mr. Simmons likes to point out that in most primitive societies, unpracticed in numbers and reckoning, they used a functional definition. Among the Eskimos, for example, one was old when his teeth wore down to the level that he could no longer use them to soften skins of animals so that they could be made into clothing. The Eskimo had no problem with the aged either. When someone reached this particular level, there was a ritualistic way of handling his retirement. It was his duty to go and sit on a block of ice and wait for his soul to be collected by some beneficent deity, which usually came around in a variety of arbitrary forms. He might be collected by a polar bear or a walrus or something like that, but his soul would be returned to the storehouse of souls to be reborn again as a young person. Everyone in the society believed this, and most old people, when their teeth wore down this way, felt impelled to go sit on the block of ice to await their fate. Now, of course, if anyone should delay for an unbecoming length of time, one of his tribesmen would be struck with moral indignation about this and might help the old person to speed his departure from the tribe. Well, the recognition of different definitions of aging and of different solutions to problems, and indeed of different problems in different societies, provided a broad perspective in which to carry on studies of aging. Early researchers in the social sciences used concepts which had developed within the general framework of sociology and social psychology. If you look into this literature, you will find that there is much writing about the problem of adjustment, the problem of role changes, of loss of roles, of a changing self-concept, and so on. But it was only recently, very recently, that new concepts applicable only to the field of aging have developed. In 1961, Elaine Cumming and William Henry published a book entitled Growing Old, in which they reported the details of an investigation undertaken in Kansas City on the social processes of aging. In the course of this work, the authors developed a new theory to explain aging as a process of progressive withdrawal from society. This new theory incorporates aging into a broader theory of society, a structural functional one, which seeks to explain all human behavior in terms of its contribution to the maintenance of societal equilibrium. Cummings and Henry's theory of disengagement explains the common sense observation that older people are less involved in life than when they were younger, by linking the observation with this general theory of society. The individual begins life unfettered by ties to society or its functions. In the course of life, individuals are carefully trained to assume the social roles which function to maintain society. In the middle years, the socialized individual is totally committed, engaged, we might say, to society through his many roles, and the work of maintaining society gets done. As aging occurs, the individual must be separated from these many roles. In short, this separation is the social process of aging, called now disengagement. The theory holds, and the work of maintaining society gets done. As aging occurs, the individual must be separated from these many roles. In short, this separation is the social process of aging, called now disengagement. The theory states that the process of aging is marked by inevitable, gradual, and satisfying disengagement. And the ultimate disengagement, of course, is death. Individuals prepare for death in such a way that by the time death occurs, they have shuffled off the important functions and roles of life so that death does not disrupt society. In contrast, the death of an engaged person, the younger or middle-aged person, is disorganizing and calls for a difficult period of adjustment by all whose lives and activities are broken by it. As an example, you might contrast that in the last year and a half or so, several very important persons have died in the United States and in England. Kennedy, Mr. Hoover, Mr. MacArthur, Mr. Churchill, all of whom were, of course, leaders of the society. Only one, however, was engaged, so to speak, at the time of his death. The others had gradually shuffled off the important roles of life and passed them on to other people. Thus, the pomp and circumstance that surrounded the funeral of Mr. Churchill was just that, pomp and circumstance. Surrounding the funeral of Mr. Kennedy, of course, was an altogether different atmosphere. Society was disrupted by the death of the engaged person. The disengagement theory says that people must be separated from these roles, otherwise, with the passing of every important person, there would be this kind of disruption. Well, 3 lines of criticism of this disengagement idea have been recognized, and let me tell you the 3 of them. One line of criticism questions the whole process of disengagement. It notes that the disengagement theory has severe limitations because the process of disengagement is not something which is limited only to aged persons. There are many people in many walks of life who tend to withdraw. Age itself is not a necessary prelude to disengagement. A second line of criticism challenges the view that disengagement is inevitable and desirable for older people. Indeed, some of the scholars closely associated with the Kansas City research feel that there is a contrasting theory. You may have read some of the works of Robert Havinghurst of the University of Chicago. He writes a great deal on the problem of aging. Havinghurst and his colleagues have gathered facts in Kansas City which lead them to think that there should be 2 contrasting theories of aging. One is the disengagement theory, which I've just described, and the other they call the activity theory. It says, in effect, that so long as health and vigor are maintained, older people are the same as middle-aged people, with essentially the same needs as middle-aged people. This view recognized, along with the disengagement theory, that decreased social interaction occurs as aging increases. But the activists argue that the disengagement runs against the desires of most aging people. Decreased social interaction takes place because society withdraws from the aged person, not because the aged person withdraws from society. From this point of view, the successful ager is one who finds substitutes for the activities that he is forced to relinquish. Substitutes for work when he retires, substitutes for his friends and loved ones when they die. However clear in theory Havinghurst's work may be, in actual research, his results are ambiguous. His subjects, the people he interviewed in Kansas City, do indicate a loss of activity, and increasingly so at older ages, and they regret the loss in activity with increasing age. They do maintain a positive evaluation of themselves as people. Havinghurst's research thus leads him to conclude that there are perhaps 2 sets of values operating simultaneously in older people. On the one hand, the desire to stay active in order to maintain a sense of worth, and on the other hand, the desire to withdraw from social commitments and to pursue a more leisurely and more contemplative way of life. The third line of criticism analyzes disengagement in a context of social structure and social trends. I shall spend the remainder of my time today discussing this aspect of the theory because a research project on the disengagement theory, which I have just completed in Spencer, Indiana, leads me to accept this particular line of criticism of this new theory in the social sciences. Arnold Rose, a sociologist at the University of Minnesota, who also has written extensively in the field of aging, has established a broad view of disengagement and this criticism. Rose acknowledges that a large proportion of the older people in the United States do tend to lose many of their roles as they age, but he considers this fact to be a consequence of American life in its present phase of organization, not a universal truth for all times and all places. Youth-centered American culture, Rose argues, accords a low status to the elderly. Many other societies, in contrast, accord special prestige and power to the elderly, do not disengage them from adult roles, or perhaps create new age-graded roles of importance for them. The situation of the elderly in the United States has been especially disengaged in the last 50 years, with the decline of self-employment and with the rise of compulsory retirement. Rose notes that some males in the United States, in spite of this, do remain active past the age of 65, and some, particularly the politician, the employer, and the professional, often take on additional membership and leadership roles after this age. Disengagement, he says, is not universally true in this society. But the great bulk of Americans are not professionals or politicians and are forced to retire at age 65 and thus to disengage. But Rose sees 5 new trends which tend to counteract the disengagement of the elderly. The 5 counter trends I'll offer to you. First, he notes that an increasing proportion of those people reaching the age 65 are too healthy and too vigorous to be content with disengagement. Secondly, Social Security, private pension plans, and the development of some sort of medical assistance are slowly increasing the economic security of the aged. As this happens, the ordinary aged person may become like the well-to-do minority of the aged today, people who continue their leadership roles beyond retirement age. Thirdly, older people are beginning to form a social movement to raise their status, a movement likely to gain an increasing number of adherents. The movement, ipso facto a form of engagement for older people, may raise the dignity and prestige of old age and counteract disengagement. Fourthly, the trend toward earlier retirement, which is now a factor considered causing disengagement, may, as it continues, produce retirement at a sufficiently young age, even in the face of a loss of life's most important roles, that the retired persons will be strongly motivated to re-engage in new roles. And fifthly, finally, the opportunities for engagement are augmenting rapidly as new forms of voluntary activities, hobbies, and so on have increased in number and availability. In addition, to some degree, there has been a cultural redefinition of leisure time activities, and they are now being defined as good in themselves. To some degree, we are discarding the traditional Protestant ethic view that only certain types of activity that we call work, are worthwhile. To the extent that we discard this point of view and accept the new point of view, we will counteract the current trend toward disengagement. Now, such thoughts suggested to me more specific limitations of the applicability of this disengagement theory. Just as disengagement might apply to a passing phase of today's America, so too it might be limited to certain parts of America today. The theory of disengagement was verified in Kansas City, a fairly large, socially heterogeneous, industrialized community. Some aspects of disengagement might be specific to that locale. In a different place, different processes or important variations on them might be found. Conditions other than aging per se might cause disengagement. These other conditions would include cultural and social structural factors. Take retirement. Forced industrial retirement at a specific chronological age necessarily breaks the ties between the retired person and his fellows. What appears to be withdrawal brought about by the demands brought about by age might instead be severance brought about as the industrial system handles the problem of the labor force. And retirement may have indirectly severing effects. In a large city, most of whose inhabitants have migrated there from elsewhere, retirement prompts many to return to the place they think of as really home. Migration of any kind affects those who are left behind. A move to a different part of a large city, a move to the ancestral home elsewhere, or in the case of the affluent few, a move to Florida or Arizona or Southern California, breaks the interaction patterns of those non-mobile persons, those who are left behind. This break would be speciously analyzed if it were ascribed to disengagement. Both migration and industrial retirement, then, might account for the process of disengagement which the researchers in Kansas City had associated with age. Let me set forth some conditions which should not be confounded with disengagement. First, the process of disengagement should not be confused with the separation from social life that comes from ill health. In the theory under study, the healthy as well as the sick disengage. To avoid ambiguity, therefore, any test of the theory must rest upon a demonstration of the disengagement of the healthy. In Spencer, the town which I studied, and in Kansas City, we interviewed only those persons who were not obviously suffering from some physical or mental illness. Secondly, the process of disengagement must be kept separate from the social withdrawal which results from reduced income or financial resources. In Kansas City and in Spencer, the samples studied included only persons living in private households. These are people who have in some way achieved the means of maintaining a degree of independence. The theory thus stated leads to several expectations about changes in the way an individual is tied to or engaged in society. Three of the measures of engagement-disengagement which were used in Kansas City to test these expectations were also used in Spencer. These were, first of all, something called roll count, in which we counted the number of different kinds of people that someone habitually interacts with. Secondly, something called life space, and by this we meant not just the number of people that one interacts with, but the amount of interaction. You may have daily interaction with someone in the house that you live in, but it might be very limited kind of interaction. On the other hand, you might have daily interaction with someone in the house that you live in, but the interaction would be quite intense. So the life space measure is a measure of the intensity of interaction. And thirdly, a measure called perceived life space. And by this we meant the way the individual sees his current interaction in society in contrast to what he thought his interaction was at some earlier point in his life. Now, Cumming and Henry found in Kansas City that there were significant declines with age in roll count, life space, and perceived life space. In Spencer, we found that roll count and perceived life space declined, but that actual life space, interaction, remained the same. To restate the conclusion, in Kansas City, the aged persons thought that their life space was diminishing, their roles were declining in number, and life space, or interaction in roles, actually declined. In Spencer, the subjects thought that their life space was diminishing, the number of their roles was declining, but life space, the amount of interaction, remained the same. In Spencer, incidentally, we found that the measures were not affected by age, not only by age, but by a host of other characteristics as well. For example, people with high roll count scores tended to be married, to be living in their own houses, living in multi-generational houses, employed in what they thought was good financial condition, to be in high rather than a low social class position, to have little free time, to regard themselves in good rather than poor health. It was not affected by other characteristics, including no difference in roll count, life space, or interaction, by religious affiliation. It was the same for all religious groups, by sex, by place of birth in the Spencer area or elsewhere, by the number of years they had lived in Spencer, the number of years that they had lived in the same house in Spencer, or by the number of particular symptoms of diseases that they thought they experienced. This didn't affect it at all. Now, if the theory of disengagement were only to concern itself with explaining diminishing roll count, life space, and perception of life space, it would have added little, if anything, to the commonplace knowledge of decreasing activity with age. But the theory goes beyond this to add that the quality of social relationships changes with disengagement. In order to study this point, the Kansas City researchers drew upon some existing interpretation of the properties of social relationships. The obligations, I'll put this on the board in just a moment, but let me say it first. The obligations of a social relationship may be specific and to the point, as when we deal with a bank teller or a bridge partner, or they may be wide-ranging, indeterminate, and diffuse, as when we deal with a friend or a member of one's family or a colleague. Social relationships differ also in emotional content. Some relationships, as with the bank teller, if not the bridge partner, are neutral so far as emotional content is concerned. Others, as with friend or family, are emotionally loaded. Cross-tabulating these kinds of social relationships gives us 4 logical types, and these I'll put on the board. If we make a little table out of this, we can cross-tabulate these and say that there are some social relationships which are specific neutral, some which are specific and emotional, some which are diffuse and neutral, and some which are diffuse and emotional. We can give names to some of these. The best example, or the one that's easiest to grasp and that we're all most familiar with, the most engaged kind of response is the social relationship which is diffuse and emotional. And this is a love relationship where we have binding ties of varied sorts, hard to pin down, with some person, and it's emotionally based, of course. So we could write in there love. A specific emotional one we can call responsiveness, or if you like the fancier gobbledygook, you can call it segmental gratification. And that's gobbledygook, all right. It means that the reward for engaging in this kind of social relationship comes from the interaction itself. It's gratifying, and it's specifically or segmentally gratifying. It involves only part of the personality. You're really not heavily committed in this kind of relationship. The neutral relationships, we just give names: approval or esteem. These will not figure importantly. These will not figure importantly in what I want to tell you. Well, pick up where I was. If we cross-tabulate these types of social relationships, we have the four logical types, which I've now set forth on the board. Specific neutral relations, as with a bank teller. Specific emotional relations, as with persons we know in card playing or other such supposedly gratifying situations. Diffuse neutral relations, as with church members or fraternity members or colleagues. And finally, diffuse emotional relations, love, as with family and close friends. The degree of engagement of these different relationships vary greatly. The diffuse affective, love, represents the most complete engagement, and the specific affective, responsiveness, represents the smallest degree of engagement. The neutral relationships, both the specific and the diffuse, are intermediate in the degree of engagement. Incidentally, at first glance it might seem that the specific neutral relationship, approval, would involve the weakest engagement because it lacks emotional content. However, specific neutral relationships, especially those of a business nature, bind the actors in a network of explicit or implicit contractual obligations. The specific emotional, on the other hand, are relationships which are gratifying only for their immediate content, such as with bridge friends, and the individuals involved do not have obligations to each other than the affair of the moment. In this sense, the specific emotional relationship, responsiveness, is less binding than the specific neutral relationship, approval. Our social life is sufficiently diverse that individuals are involved in all of these relationships and seek the rewards that accompany each of them. But preferences for particular types of relationships and particular rewards vary. Disengagement theory suggests that preferences shift as aging occurs. The preferred roles of middle years, the most engaged period of life, are the roles of firmest engagement: love, esteem, approval. As aging occurs, and disengagement, the individual supposedly cuts some of the diffuse links to life and replaces them with more specific ones. Accordingly, the aging individual should alter his preference for love to a preference for responsiveness. As he ages, he should move from diffuse emotional to specific emotional. The data gathered in Kansas City on this interesting question seem to confirm the expectations. The percentage preferring engagement, love, declined slightly, but with statistical significance, from 25% of those in their 50s and 60s to 20% of those in their 70s. The percentages desiring approval declined greatly, from 53% of those in their 50s to 25% of those in their 70s. But the most striking change in the Kansas City subjects was the great increase in the percentage desiring responsiveness, the disengaged response. The percentages went from 7% of those in their 50s to 30% of those in their 70s. So more than a fourfold increase. It did appear that the case was made. But dissimilar results were elicited in Spencer, where the subjects made very different choices about desired social relationships. In Kansas City, 62 out of 163 subjects, that is 38%, preferred approval relationships. In Spencer, only 2 out of 326, less than 1%, made such a choice. Similar differences were shown by the preferences for the love relationship. In Kansas City, only 23% of the subjects said that love was their most desired social relationship, 23%. In Spencer, 83% said that love was the most desired social relationship. Not only are these summary choices different, But the distribution of these choices in age groups is also different. The Spencer data show no trends at all by age. The percentage choosing one or another relationship are relatively similar in all age groups. Such gross differences between the two studies are difficult to explain. The subjects of these two studies were alike in population composition, relatively healthy, living in independent households, over 50 years of age, white, predominantly Protestant. Some differences might have been produced because different forms of questions were used in the two studies to get at orientation toward interaction, but these were minor differences in the questions. The remaining alternative is that there is something different about the nature of these communities which cause the different orientations. Whatever the difference is, it must explain the fact that in Kansas City, people prefer specific neutral relationships, and the Spencer people prefer diffuse emotional relationships. What immediately comes to mind as an explanation is a traditional sociological view of something called urbanism as a way of life, different from ruralism as a way of life. People who live in cities take on folkways which are different from those of a small town. The city dweller is bombarded daily with a host of stimuli eliciting emotional involvement and commitment. In order to protect himself from these stimuli and their threat to dissipate his psychic energies, the city dweller develops habits of sophistication, calculability, a blasé attitude, indifference, and impersonality. Impersonality implies that he is interested in other people not as whole personalities, but instead as segments of personalities. In other words, he seeks neutral and specific relationships, relationships of approval at all ages, although with declining frequency as age increases. The more restricted environment of the small town resident, on the other hand, promotes attitudes favoring engagement regardless of age. This may be the lure of the small town. The desire for emotional commitment in Spencer relates to the other measures of disengagement in interesting ways. Commitment preferences persist despite the fact that roll count declines and the perception of life space declines. That these preferences persist may help to explain the fact that life space, interaction in roles, does not decline in Spencer as it did in Kansas City. The kinds of roles that persist in small town life are emotionally diffuse ones with considerable interaction. As a further indication of this, we can note that in Spencer, those who have the lowest life space scores are those who prefer the approval type of relationship, which is the type that predominates in Kansas City. The 2 points made at the beginning of my talk concerning mobility and industrial retirement also apply in explanation of these differences between Spencer residents and Kansas City residents. Retirement in Spencer did not come all at once at age 65, and the cessation of work did not sever the ties to friends and associates because the town is too small to get lost in. Although we have no way of knowing how many people moved away from Spencer when they grew old, we do have approximate information. Only 12% of our subjects who reported a loss of friends between the age of 45 and their current age said that the loss had occurred because their friends moved away. Only 12% in that long period of time. Incidentally, a fairly noticeable number of aged Spencerites have recently returned there to live out their old age. Their movement leaves broken ties in Indianapolis or wherever they spent their middle years, Kansas City, perhaps. Well, these preliminary summary findings need many refinements and modifications, of course, and as these come out of our computing machines, we hope that we'll be able to give a clearer picture of aging in this small town and to test this emerging theory of disengagement to a greater degree than has been the case before. we have discovered that aging occurs in ways different from those found in the large city where disengagement had previously been studied. In summary and in conclusion, as small town people grow old, roll count decreases, perceived life space decreases, and many people lose their sense of identity with the community. But life space does not change, nor is there a change in the character of preferred social relationships. More studies will be needed to see if similar trends can be found in other big cities in addition to Kansas City and in other small towns in addition to Spencer. But that the studies are needed shows how fruitful the initial statement of the disengagement idea is for contemporary social science research in aging. Thank you.